Hey everybody, it's Ray here. I'm in beautiful Newfoundland along this gorgeous coast on a beautiful morning. So I wanted to talk to you about this Nikon 400mm f2.8 with the built-in teleconverter to try and answer the question, is it worth it for this lens? And mainly, the important thing I want to talk about is it worth the built-in teleconverter? How great is that? Or is it necessary to even use a teleconverter anymore with the resolution of these cameras? So right now I have my Nikon Z6 II mounted on this because I dropped my Z9 and it's getting repaired right now. But normally I'm shooting the Nikon Z9 on this lens, which means I have a 45 megapixel sensor. And what I've discovered, to my surprise, thanks to the suggestion of Tobias Yoder, an amazing photographer, I believe he's based out of Texas, and he asked me when I first got this, he said, is there any difference between shooting it at 400mm 2.8 and then cropping that in and enlarging it to the same size as shooting with the teleconverter in, so 560 f4. So is there any difference in the look of the photos? And I thought for sure there would be. I thought for sure when you flip that teleconverter in, you're optically changing things. It's not just the same as cropping in, I thought, because you're putting a teleconverter in there, you're putting glass in there, and you're changing the focal length from 400mm to 560mm. And in my head, I thought there was going to be a difference, but I'm about to show you there is visually no difference in the look of those photos between the two. So, in other words, if you shoot at 400mm 2.8 and then just crop in to the same frame size that you would see when you have the teleconverter in for the equivalent of 560mm at f4, there's going to be no discernible difference in the look, the perspective, and even the foreground background blur and bokeh. They completely look indiscernible. Now maybe if you zoomed in really far on the computer and really dig in there, you might be able to see a minor difference in those foregrounds and backgrounds between the two. But for the most part, when you look at these images as a whole, they basically look the same, which means the only advantage you're gaining from that teleconverter is resolution.
Okay, we've got these two photos here. Snowy egret, basically it barely moved. I barely moved. All I did was flip that teleconverter in to get the 560mm version versus the 400mm version. So you can see how much more image we get around the 400mm version, which is great. But let's see what happens if we line these up. So I'm going to move the 400mm over here. I'll label each layer. So we have the 560mm layer on the bottom. That's the version with the teleconverter in. And the 400mm version up top here. I'm going to lower the opacity to 50% so I can kind of line these guys up. And let's start enlarging these images and see if we can get them close enough. So we'll just try, I'm basically just going to try and get the heads at the same height, which would be approximately the same size. We'll enter that, and then we'll just try and move these left and right to kind of get them close. The bird did move a little bit. All right, back to 100% opacity. Okay, here we go. So we have 400mm version on the top that has now been scaled up to match what would be the equivalent of if we flip the teleconverter in. So that's what we're looking at here. And let me toggle these on and off. So I want you to take a look at that. Now watch, let's see. I can lighten that background image just a little bit more because that one definitely is showing a little bit darker. So let's give it a little bit more. We'll try and match these exactly. At least there our background and our foreground are close. So here we go. Right now, here's the 400mm version scaled up. There's the 560mm version. I want you to really take notice of the characteristics of these bokeh balls and the background. I mean, there's just, the difference is so negligible. All this was the slightest movement of these bubbles on the surface of the water and me probably moving slightly, and then obviously the bird turned its head, you know, just a little bit. But if we zoom in all the way and take a look in here, I mean, other than the movement, none of this stuff is changing. Like, watch these bokeh balls, like they look identical. And if we come up here to the bird itself and look, there's our 560mm. Here's our 400mm scaled up. I mean, even at that rate, guess these feathers are slightly less sharp with the scaled up version than they are there. So that's the minor difference. And this is what I'm getting at. This is that resolution difference. But in reality, you're not going to scale this photo up at that point. You would just crop in and have a slightly lower resolution version. And so if I were to crop that in to approximately the same size, let's go back to Lightroom and do that. This will take a little bit of time here, some trial and error. But let's see, we'll crop down here and then roughly there, I think. And let's try and compare these side by side now. Oh, now I went too far. Well, anyway, I'll just do this one more time here, little change. And let's look at our resolution here. So we have the cropped in 400mm version to get approximately the same frame as we would have gotten if we flipped the teleconverter in, is at 3745 by 5617 pixels. So let's look at that. 3745 by 5617 is 21 megapixel image. So we're still at over a 20 megapixel image, even after that crop, which is plenty of resolution. Like, what more do you need than that? If I did, let's see, 3745 divided by 300 DPI, that's still a 12.5 by, let's see, 5617 divided by 300. Yeah, 12.5 by 18.5 inch print at 300 DPI. That can be enlarged to basically damn near any size and look great for a wall size print. So again, my point is you're only losing resolution. This is higher resolution than, especially the vertical resolution, than any monitor you can get out there that I'm aware of. So it's already, you know, higher resolution. When I click on my screen to zoom into 100% zoom, I'm getting a ton of zoom in on this. So there's just a lot more resolution here in that file. And when we go back to this, I just want to show you this one more time. The difference in the out of focus background and the difference in the actual size and rendition of these bokeh balls is just almost indiscernible. If there is a difference, like I told you, I know this stuff moved a little bit, so that's what's accounting for the slightest bit of error and difference there. But I mean, you're never going to see that in a real world scenario other than doing what I'm doing right here, stacking these up and showing you the before and after from one to the other. It's going to be impossible to tell, did I crop a 400mm version in or did I use the teleconverter? Nobody's ever going to be able to tell in the end. So my take is the teleconverter is kind of useless other than to give you that resolution advantage.
So you are gaining something when you flip that teleconverter in and go to 560mm. Because we are essentially cropping in at that point optically, you get the full resolution of whatever camera you're shooting. So when I'm shooting my Z9, I'm getting the full 45 megapixels on that cropped in portion. Whereas if I were to shoot at 400mm and then crop in post, the resolution would obviously be lower. But here's my argument. What do most of us do with most of our images? We share them online. Where do we share them online? A lot of us is like Instagram, and it doesn't matter honestly where you share it. Most people, the majority of people, are viewing your photos on a phone. So they're viewing it on a tiny screen, which does not at all need 45 megapixels. So in theory, you'd actually be better off shooting always at 400mm 2.8 because it's a lower aperture, which means you're getting faster shutter speed and or a lower ISO. And so better image quality is coming out of it. And then you just crop in a little bit to get the same kind of focal length and crop that you would have by putting that optical teleconverter in there. That's really how it ends up working, you know? And even knowing that though, I will say, I still love flipping that teleconverter in. So some of the other thoughts I have about that. When you have the teleconverter in, you get to see the frame live in that moment. So I get to actually sort of kind of see the 560mm tighter frame and kind of compose it accordingly. That being said, the argument to stay at 400mm means I get to kind of compose it more in post, right? Because I have more space around it at 400mm, so I can really just take all the time I want to compose it. If I were to put the teleconverter in and shoot at 560mm and then decide on a composition in the field, I can't show any more outside of that frame after the fact. Whereas if I shot at 400 millimeter, I could. But I do have to say, I do like seeing that cropped in view live in the field, so I can kind of decide how I want to compose it then. It just feels a little bit more interactive in the moment, I guess, instead of just doing it in the computer in post. But, you know, there's really not much of a difference there, again, because you can always just kind of make that same crop in post off the 400 millimeter image. So in the end, I do still flip this teleconverter in a lot. It is nice to have that added resolution sometimes, but it's nice to see it in the computer. That's it. It really serves no purpose beyond that, because beyond that, I'm sharing my photos online. Even for all the printing purposes I do, so getting published, if I ever were to enter into a contest, that cropped in 400 millimeter image, you know, cropped in on a 45 megapixel sensor is more than enough resolution for all of those needs. So there just basically is no need or reason to honestly put that teleconverter in, you know? And for those of you that have lenses where you have to physically put a teleconverter in, it's not just a built-in thing, I don't really think you're missing out on too much, you know? With higher resolution sensors, I think a teleconverter is kind of a thing of the past, at least a 1.4. If you get into the 2x range, well then it might be a different story, because you're adding so much focal length to it at that point versus just cropping in post. Then that would be a significant crop in post. But for the 1.4 crop with high resolution sensors, doesn't seem like a teleconverter is really necessary. So those are my thoughts on the built-in teleconverter. Let me know what you think after you've seen these photos.